In 1942, a genius was born in America. His IQ was higher than most scientists. He studied at Harvard. He became a mathematics professor before most people even started their careers. But decades later, that same genius would become the most hunted bomber in America. For 17 years, he outsmarted the FBI, killed innocent people, and declared war on modern technology. The most shocking part? Some people still believe he was right. This is the story of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. In 1942, a child was born in America. A child so intelligent that many people believed he was destined for greatness. His IQ was reportedly around 170. He skipped grades, solved problems that challenged adults, and entered one of the most prestigious universities in the world while most teenagers were still in high school. But decades later, that same child would become one of the most feared criminals in American history. He would spend nearly 17 years bombing universities, scientists, and technology-related targets. He would launch one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in FBI history. And he would become known by a name the entire world remembers, the Unabomber. But how does a genius become a terrorist? That question begins with a lonely boy named Ted Kaczynski. Ted was born into a working-class Polish-American family near Chicago. His parents weren't wealthy. They weren't connected. They lived an ordinary life. Yet from the moment Ted entered school, it became obvious that he wasn't ordinary. Teachers quickly realized he possessed exceptional intelligence. Schoolwork came effortlessly to him. He consistently outperformed students much older than himself. But while intelligence opened doors, it also created distance. Ted struggled socially. He found it difficult to connect with other children. He spent much of his time alone, living inside a world of ideas and thoughts that few people around him seemed to understand. As he grew older, that isolation only became stronger. At the age of 16, Ted was accepted into Harvard University. For most families, it would have been a dream come true. For Ted, it would become the beginning of a transformation. Harvard was filled with students from wealthy and influential backgrounds. Many came from elite schools and privileged families. Ted came from a very different world. He was younger than nearly everyone around him. He often felt out of place. Back home, he had always been the smartest person in the room. At Harvard, he was surrounded by brilliant minds. For the first time in his life, intelligence alone wasn't enough to make him special. The experience hit him hard. Over time, he became withdrawn and increasingly isolated. He stopped socializing, his grades began to suffer, he spent more and more time alone inside his dorm room. Friends became rare. Conversations became rare. The young genius who had once seemed destined for greatness was slowly falling apart. What Ted didn't know was that someone at Harvard had taken an interest in him. That person was Henry Murray. Murray was one of the most respected psychologists in America. He had spent years studying personality, behavior, and psychological stress. Near the end of his career, he launched an experiment that would later become one of the most controversial studies associated with Harvard University. And Ted Kaczynski became one of the participants. The experiment seemed harmless at first. Students were asked to write essays describing their deepest beliefs, values, and personal philosophies. They poured their thoughts onto paper, their hopes, their fears, their view of the world. What they didn't know was that those essays would soon be used against them. Participants were placed in highly stressful confrontations where trained individuals aggressively attacked their beliefs. Every argument was challenged. Every weakness was targeted. Every emotional reaction was carefully observed and recorded. Students sat under bright lights while researchers monitored their responses. Some participants later described the experience as humiliating and psychologically exhausting. Ted appeared to react more intensely than most. Researchers noted that he showed unusually strong emotional responses during the sessions. Years later, many people would look back at these experiments and wonder whether they played a role in shaping the man Ted eventually became. There is no evidence that the study alone created the Unabomber. Many students participated without becoming violent criminals. But for Ted, the experience seemed to deepen feelings that were already growing inside him. Anger, alienation, and distrust. As the years passed, those feelings evolved into something much larger. Ted began developing a profound hatred for modern industrial society. He believed technology was slowly destroying human freedom. He believed large institutions were gaining too much control over people's lives. And he became increasingly convinced that society was moving in a dangerous direction. After graduating from Harvard, Ted continued his academic success. He earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. His talent was extraordinary. Soon afterward, he was hired by the University of California, Berkeley. At just 25 years old, he became one of the youngest professors on campus. His future looked incredibly bright, but Ted wasn't interested in the future everyone else imagined for him. He disliked teaching, he disliked academia, and he increasingly disliked the technological world that surrounded him. Then, without warning, he quit. No lengthy explanation, no dramatic farewell. He simply walked away. When family members asked why, his answer revealed how deeply his beliefs had changed. He said he was tired of teaching mathematics to future engineers. To Ted, engineers weren't building progress. They were helping construct a system that he believed would eventually enslave humanity. By now, his decision had already been made. He would reject modern society completely. He purchased a small piece of land near Lincoln, Montana. Together with his brother, he built a tiny wooden cabin deep in the wilderness. There was no electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences, just trees, silence, and isolation. For Ted, it was freedom. For everyone else, it looked like a strange and lonely existence. But inside that small cabin, something dangerous was beginning to grow. A belief that technology wasn't simply a problem, a belief that it was an enemy. And before long, Ted Kaczynski would decide that enemies needed to be fought, no matter the cost. For Ted Kaczynski, life inside the Montana wilderness wasn't an escape, it was preparation. While the rest of America embraced technology, Ted watched from a distance and grew increasingly convinced that modern society was heading toward disaster. From his tiny cabin, he spent years reading, writing, and refining his beliefs. The more he thought about the world, the more convinced he became that technology was humanity's greatest threat. And eventually, he decided that words alone weren't enough. He wanted people to listen. His first attack came in 1978. A suspicious package was delivered to a university. When it was opened, it exploded. The injuries were relatively minor, but the message had been sent. A year later, another bomb appeared. Then another, and another. At first, the attack seemed random. The victims had little in common. Some worked at universities, others worked in the airline industry. A few appeared to have no connection to one another at all, but investigators slowly began noticing a pattern. The bombs were remarkably sophisticated. Each device was handcrafted. Each one carried subtle signatures that suggested they had been built by the same person. The attacker left almost no evidence behind. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no clear motive. The FBI soon realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary criminal. They were hunting a highly intelligent individual who carefully planned every move. Because many of the attacks involved universities and airlines, investigators created a name for the unknown bomber: the University and Airline Bomber. Eventually, that title was shortened. The world would come to know him as the Unabomber. Throughout the 1980s, the attacks continued. Victims were injured across multiple states. Some survived with permanent disabilities, others narrowly escaped death. And with every explosion, public fear grew. The most frustrating part for investigators was that the bomber seemed invisible. He didn't claim responsibility, he didn't issue demands, he didn't communicate with the media. Most terrorists want something: money, political concessions, attention. The Unabomber appeared to want none of those things. That mystery made him even more dangerous. Then, in 1985, everything changed. A computer store owner named Hugh Scruton noticed a small object outside his business. Moments later, it exploded. Scruton became the Unabomber's first murder victim. The killing shocked the nation. For the first time, Americans realized they weren't dealing with a prankster or extremist vandal. They were dealing with a killer. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Montana, Ted followed the news closely. To him, the attacks were more than acts of violence. They were statements. Messages directed at a society he believed was destroying itself. As years passed, the FBI devoted enormous resources to the investigation. Agents analyzed bomb fragments. They interviewed witnesses. They followed countless leads. Yet the bomber remained unidentified. Then, in 1987, investigators finally caught a break. Outside a computer store in Salt Lake City, a witness spotted a suspicious man placing a package near a building. The witness provided a description. Police created a sketch. For the first time, the FBI had an image of the man they were hunting. The sketch spread across the country. And then something unexpected happened. The bombing stopped. Months passed. Then years. 5 years went by without a single attack. Many investigators wondered if the Unabomber was dead. Others believed he had abandoned his campaign. But they were wrong. Ted Kaczynski hadn't disappeared. He was evolving. Deep inside his cabin, he continued building bombs. He continued writing. And most importantly, he continued developing an ideology that would eventually become known around the world. By the early 1990s, he had reached a conclusion. Violence alone would never accomplish his goal. If he wanted to change society, people needed to understand his ideas. And so he began writing a manifesto. A document that would explain everything: his beliefs, his fears, his hatred of modern industrial civilization, his warnings about the future. Then, after 5 years of silence, the Unabomber returned. The new attacks were more focused than ever. This time, many of his targets represented the technological future he despised. A computer scientist was injured. A geneticist was injured. The message was becoming increasingly clear. Ted wasn't choosing victims randomly. He was targeting people connected to scientific and technological progress. Then came another escalation. In 1994 and 1995, 2 more people were killed. The attacks became deadlier. The bombs became more sophisticated, and public pressure on the FBI intensified. After nearly 2 decades, America's most wanted terrorist was still free. Then everything changed. The New York Times received a letter. For the first time, the Unabomber publicly claimed responsibility for his crimes. But he wasn't just claiming credit. He was making an offer. If major newspapers published a lengthy manifesto he had written, he promised to stop the bombings forever. The proposal created an enormous dilemma. The FBI traditionally refused to negotiate with terrorists. Yet investigators also recognized something important. The manifesto might be their best chance to identify him. For years, they had searched for fingerprints, witnesses, and physical evidence. Perhaps the answer had been hiding somewhere else all along. In his words, his writing style, his ideas, his vocabulary. Eventually, authorities agreed to publish the manifesto. It was a controversial decision. Many feared it would reward terrorism. Others believed it might save lives. When the document finally appeared in newspapers, the public reaction was immediate. Millions of people wanted to read it. Newspaper sales surged. Long lines formed outside stores. Everyone wanted to know what the mysterious bomber had been trying to say for nearly 2 decades. The manifesto opened with a sentence that instantly became famous. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. For some readers, the document was disturbing. For others, it was fascinating. Many disagreed with Ted's conclusions. Yet some were surprised by how thoughtful and detailed portions of the argument appeared. The manifesto criticized technology. It criticized industrial society. It warned about environmental destruction. It warned about increasing dependence on large systems and institutions. And hidden within those pages were clues. Clues that would soon reach someone who knew Ted Kaczynski better than almost anyone else. His younger brother, David Kaczynski. Without realizing it, the Unabomber had finally made the mistake that would bring his 17-year campaign to an end. David Kaczynski didn't want to believe it. The idea was almost impossible to accept. The man being hunted by the FBI wasn't supposed to be a stranger. He wasn't supposed to be America's most wanted terrorist. He was supposed to be his brother. Growing up, David had admired Ted. Despite the age difference, the two had shared a close bond. They spent countless hours discussing philosophy, politics, science, and society. Ted was brilliant, quiet, different, but never violent. At least that's what David believed. When his wife Linda first suggested that Ted might be the Unabomber, David rejected the idea immediately. He remembered a brother who cared deeply about ideas, a brother who was sensitive and thoughtful, a brother who once became upset after hearing about an injured animal. How could that person become a murderer? But after the manifesto was published, Linda encouraged him to read it carefully, so he did. And with every page, the feeling became stronger. The writing felt familiar. The arguments felt familiar. The unusual phrases felt familiar. It sounded exactly like Ted. The same hostility toward technology, the same criticism of industrial society, the same cold, logical style. By the time David reached the final pages, he was terrified. Deep down, he already knew the truth. America's most wanted terrorist was his brother. For weeks, David struggled with the decision. If he stayed silent, innocent people could die. If he spoke up, he would destroy his own family. It was one of the most painful choices of his life. Eventually, he contacted the FBI. He provided letters Ted had written years earlier. Experts compared those letters with the manifesto. The similarities were overwhelming. Sentence structures matched. Vocabulary matched. Ideas matched. For the first time in nearly 17 years, investigators had a credible suspect. The FBI quietly launched surveillance operations around Ted's cabin near Lincoln, Montana. Agents watched, waited, collected evidence. Yet there was still one problem. They didn't know what was inside the cabin. There could be explosives, booby traps, weapons. Nobody wanted to risk a direct confrontation, so investigators created a plan. They would lure Ted outside, then move in before he had time to react. On April 3, 1996, that plan was put into action. Several agents approached the cabin pretending to be surveyors. Ted stepped outside to speak with them. Within seconds, federal agents moved in. The 17-year hunt was over. The Unabomber had finally been captured. What investigators discovered inside the cabin shocked even experienced FBI agents. The tiny wooden structure looked primitive from the outside. Inside, it contained an entire world. There were journals, maps, bomb components, chemical materials, drafts of letters, copies of the manifesto, detailed notes about attacks. Investigators also discovered coded writings that documented years of planning and preparation. Some of the codes were extremely complex. Fortunately for the FBI, Ted had made a critical mistake. He left behind information that allowed investigators to decode much of the material. Once the journals were translated, the evidence became overwhelming. The writings described bombings, victims, targets, motives, future plans. And beneath his bed, agents found something even more disturbing: a fully constructed bomb ready to be mailed. Had Ted remained free, more attacks would likely have followed. There was no longer any doubt. The FBI had found their man. The case moved toward trial, but another battle was about to begin. This time, it wasn't between Ted and the government, it was between Ted and his own defense team. His lawyers wanted to argue that he suffered from severe mental illness. If successful, that argument could save him from the death penalty. But Ted hated the idea. He didn't want people believing he was insane. He didn't want his actions dismissed as madness, because in his mind, that would destroy everything he had tried to say. Ted believed his ideas were rational. He believed his conclusions were logical. He wanted history to view him as a political thinker, not as a mentally ill criminal. The conflict became so intense that he repeatedly clashed with his attorneys. Eventually, rather than risk a death sentence, Ted accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to multiple crimes. In return, he received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial was over. But public debate about Ted Kaczynski was only beginning. Even behind bars, he continued writing. He exchanged letters with academics, journalists, and supporters around the world. Some people viewed him as nothing more than a terrorist. Others viewed him as a warning. Not because they supported violence, but because some of his criticisms of modern society appeared increasingly relevant. Ted argued that technology was making people dependent. He argued that freedom was gradually being surrendered to larger systems. He warned that surveillance would continue expanding. He warned that people would become increasingly connected to machines. Decades later, many of those concerns remain part of public debate. Today, billions of people spend much of their lives online. Governments and corporations collect enormous amounts of data. Social media influences politics, culture, and behavior. Artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming society, and concerns about privacy, mental health, and technology addiction continue to grow. This doesn't mean Ted was right, nor does it justify his actions. But it explains why discussions about his ideas never completely disappeared. One of the strangest chapters of Ted's life unfolded in prison. Despite spending most of his life struggling with relationships, he began receiving letters from admirers. Some viewed him as a misunderstood genius. Others became fascinated by the mystery surrounding him. Among those correspondents was a woman who eventually became very important to him. The two exchanged letters for years. They spoke during prison visits. Ted even referred to her as his girlfriend. Yet there was a tragic reality to their relationship. They would never truly share a life together. Prison walls made that impossible. Years later, she died from cancer. Not long afterward, Ted himself began suffering from serious health problems. In June 2023, at the age of 81, Ted Kaczynski died in federal prison. His life was over. But the debate surrounding him survived. To some people, he remains a domestic terrorist responsible for murder, fear, and suffering. To others, he remains a deeply troubled genius who identified real problems but chose the worst possible way to respond to them. And that contradiction is what makes his story so fascinating. Ted Kaczynski warned about freedom while taking freedom away from others. He condemned violence within society while committing violence himself. He criticized systems of control while attempting to force people to listen through fear. That contradiction can never be ignored. In the end, the story of the Unabomber isn't simply about bombs. It's about intelligence, isolation, ideology, and the dangerous consequences that can emerge when brilliant ideas become consumed by obsession. More than 20 years after his capture, Ted Kaczynski remains one of the most controversial figures in modern American history. A mathematical genius, a terrorist, a recluse, a killer, a man whose warnings about the future still spark debate, and a man whose crimes ensured that debate will never be simple. The question people continue asking today is the same question they asked when the manifesto first appeared. Can an idea have value if it is delivered through violence? For Ted Kaczynski, the answer was yes. For much of the world, the answer remains no. And that is why the story of the Unabomber continues to be remembered, not only as a criminal investigation, but as one of the most disturbing and complicated stories of the modern age.